This story belongs to a man named Daniel Hargrove. Everything from this point forward is told from his perspective. There's a version of your life that exists only in your head, the version where everything is more or less fine, where the house is paid on time, the kids are healthy, the person sleeping next to you is the person you think they are. You build that version carefully over years, and you get so comfortable inside it that you stop looking too closely at the walls. I lived inside that version for a long time. My life in the early 2000s looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Decent job, good neighborhood, 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 4 and 6 years old at the time. My wife had a part-time job that kept her busy a few days a week, and on the other days, she managed the house, the kids, the routine. We weren't passionate anymore, not the way we'd been at the beginning, but I didn't think much of that. I figured that was just what marriage looked like after a few years. The heat settles into something quieter. I told myself that was normal. I was good at telling myself things were normal. The first crack was so small I almost missed it. My kids started mentioning their grandparents more. Grandma's house, Grandpa's cooking, spending the day over there. Kids talk about their days in this loose, non-linear way where everything gets jumbled together, and at first I filed it under background noise. But then it started coming up more frequently, and something in the back of my mind snagged on it. My wife's parents lived 90 minutes away, not around the corner, not a quick drive across town, an hour and a half each way. 3 hours of driving, round trip multiple times a week, on days she wasn't working. I did the math quietly one evening while the kids were in bed. It didn't add up. It didn't come close to adding up. I brought it up gently. I wasn't accusatory. I genuinely gave her the chance to explain it in a way that made sense. She brushed it off, said she liked giving the kids time with their grandparents, said she needed the break sometimes. Both of those things could have been true. But she said them too quickly, and her eyes did something they always did when she was uncomfortable. They went slightly sideways toward the wall, like she was reading something written there that only she could see. I'd known that tale for years. I just never had a reason to watch for it before, so I started watching the car. I kept a small notebook. Every night before bed, I'd walk past her car in the driveway and check the odometer, jot the number down, then check it again the next evening. It took about a week before the pattern was undeniable. She was putting roughly 400 extra miles on that car every single week. Not 30, not 50. 400 miles of driving that had no accounting in anything she'd told me. I didn't say a word. I just kept writing the numbers down. There are moments in life that feel like they were placed there, like the universe got impatient with your hesitation and just handed you the thing you needed. I don't know what I believe about fate or coincidence, but I know that what happened on that Tuesday afternoon felt less like luck and more like inevitability. I came home early from work. Nothing dramatic about it. I had a headache, left the office an hour before I normally would, walked in through the back door. My wife had been using the family computer in the home office and had just moved to another room. The monitor was still warm. I sat down to check something work-related, and that's when I saw it. A yellow, sticky note. Pressed against the side of the keyboard, the handwriting in her particular looping cursive, an AOL email address, and a password written right underneath it. I sat there and looked at it for a while. I'm not someone who makes fast decisions. I think things through. I consider angles. But sitting in that chair, in that quiet house, with 400 unexplained miles a week, sitting in my notebook upstairs, I wasn't thinking about ethics. I was thinking about whether I could survive continuing to not know. I typed in the address. I typed in the password. The inbox opened. I read for a long time. Long enough that the room got darker around me, and I didn't get up to turn on the light. There was a thread between my wife and her college friend. Long, casual, the kind of correspondence between two people who've known each other for years and have no filter with each other. They were talking about a man, not in passing, in detail, regular meetings, regular arrangements. His name wasn't there, not in full, but the shape of the relationship was unmistakable. And then there were the other parts, the parts where my wife and her friend made jokes about this man's wife, about her weight after 3 kids. Casual cruelty dressed up as gossip, the kind that flows easily between people who've decided that the person they're discussing doesn't quite count as real. That hit me differently than the affair itself. The affair was a wound, but that, the lightness of it, the laughter underneath it, that told me something about who I was married to that I hadn't known before, or hadn't let myself know. I got up, connected the printer, and printed every single page of that thread. I put the pages in a lockbox that lived in the back of my closet, behind a bag of winter gear she never touched. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. I didn't cry. I'm not saying that to sound tough, I just didn't. What I felt was closer to a very deep, very quiet settling, like something that had been slightly out of alignment for a long time had finally shifted into its true position, and now I could see the actual shape of things. I knew what I was going to do. I just needed to do it correctly. I had a friend on the local police force. We'd known each other since our 20s, the kind of friendship that gets less frequent but more reliable as you get older. I called him the next day, didn't give him the whole story, just enough. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "You need someone professional. I know a guy." That was how I met Ron. Ron had spent years on the force before leaving to set up his own private investigation practice. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they've spent a long time paying attention to things other people miss. He didn't react visibly to much. You could tell him something that would make a normal person's eyebrows go up, and he'd just nod slowly, like you'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. I sat across from him at a table in his office and laid out what I had: the notebook with the odometer readings, the printed emails, the timeline. He looked at everything methodically, asked a few precise questions, and then told me he'd be in touch. What Ron produced over the next few weeks was something I was not fully prepared for, even though I'd hired him to produce exactly that. He found the routine quickly. My wife would drive the 90 minutes to her parents', drop the kids with their grandmother, and then double back to meet this man for lunch at a specific restaurant they used regularly. After lunch, they'd go to a motel about 20 minutes outside of town, a low, flat building with a parking lot that backed up against a drainage ditch, the kind of place that exists specifically for arrangements like theirs. She'd be back to collect the kids by late afternoon. Ron had photographs, timestamps, plate numbers, a complete documented record that left nothing to interpretation. He also had a name, the man's full name, and everything attached to it. His name was Bob. Bob was married, 3 children, and held the title of Executive Vice President at a prominent regional company. He drove a luxury car and lived in a large house in an upscale part of the county. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man who looks at his own reflection and sees someone who has things figured out. But Ron had kept pulling on the thread. The company Bob ran with such visible authority, it belonged entirely to his father-in-law. Bob had married into it. The house where he lived with his family, also owned by his father-in-law. His title, his salary, his address, his entire constructed image of success, every single piece of it was borrowed from the family of the woman he was betraying. Ron slid that portion of the report across the table and watched my face while I read it. I didn't say much. I just sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I looked at Ron and said, "Make me a few extra copies of the full file." He made them without asking why. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a vengeful person by nature. I don't enjoy conflict. I never have. My parents spent years destroying each other and everything around them, and I grew up in the wreckage of that, and what I took from it was a very firm, very deeply held understanding that certain things are not acceptable. Not because of pride, not because of ego, because I had seen what happens when people treat each other as disposable, and I had promised myself very young that I would never be the person who looked the other way when it happened to me. That promise was the quiet engine underneath everything I did in the weeks that followed. I hired a divorce attorney. Not the cheapest option, not someone I found on a flyer. Someone with a reputation for being thorough and unsentimental. I sat across from him and put Ron's full file on the desk and watched him go through it page by page. He didn't flinch. Lawyers like him don't flinch. He just started making notes. The papers were drawn up. The legal process was in motion. But I wasn't finished. I had one more thing to arrange. Bob's wife had 3 children and a husband who was spending her father's money on motel rooms with my wife. She was in those photographs, tangentially, referenced in those emails, mocked in them. Her body discussed between 2 women who thought she didn't matter. She deserved to know what was happening in her own life. What she chose to do with that information was entirely her decision. I wasn't going to script it. I wasn't going to manage her reaction or point her in any direction. I just believed very simply that she had the right to know. I gave Ron a copy of the full file, the PI report, the photographs, the printed emails, all of it. And I asked him to find a moment when she was alone at the house, approach her respectfully, and give it to her. He did. From what Ron told me afterward, she was outside near the front of the house when he pulled up. She listened to who he was and why he was there. She took the envelope with both hands. She didn't cry, not while Ron was watching. She just stood there in her driveway holding this thick envelope and looked at it for a long moment. Ron left. Then I made the other call. I coordinated with the process server, confirmed the timing, and set the day. My wife went to work that morning the same way she always did. Coffee, keys, a brief goodbye. Nothing in her manner suggested she had any idea what was coming. That's the strange thing about the days when everything changes. They usually start like any other day. The world doesn't give you a warning sound. She was at her desk in the middle of her regular Tuesday when the process server walked through the door of her workplace. He called her name in front of her colleagues. He handed her the papers, the document that told her, formally and legally, that our marriage was over and that the reason for its end was documented thoroughly. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I had spent weeks doing the hard, quiet work of what needed to happen, and I didn't need a front row seat to the moment it landed. Miles across town at roughly the same hour, Bob's world was beginning its own unraveling. His wife had been sitting with that envelope for days. She knew. She had known since Ron left the driveway. Whatever she felt in those intervening days, and I can only imagine the scope of it, she had been processing it in private, and by the time she was ready to move, she moved decisively. She drove to the bank, their joint account. She withdrew everything in it and closed it. Then she took her children and left. Bob came home to an empty house and a zero balance. The morning after his wife disappeared, Bob went to work. Maybe out of habit, maybe because work was the one remaining structure in his suddenly structureless life. Maybe because he genuinely believed that whatever was happening at home could be compartmentalized from the rest of it. Some people are extraordinary at that kind of denial. They've practiced it. He walked into the building where he had been executive vice president, where he had an office with his name on the door, where people addressed him with the particular deference reserved for men who control other people's livelihoods. Security met him at the entrance. His father-in-law, who had built the company, who had given Bob the title and the salary and the business cards and the parking spot, who had opened his family and his assets to a man who repaid that with years of quiet betrayal, had been informed. He had spent the night being informed in detail with photographs attached. Bob's belongings were in a box in the parking lot. His credentials were deactivated. His title was gone. His employment was over. The house papers came next. Eviction filings move at a pace that feels almost bureaucratically gentle compared to the violence of what precedes them, but they arrive. The house that Bob and his family had lived in, with the landscaping and the driveway and the square footage that had formed the backdrop of his self-image, it belonged to his father-in-law. The father-in-law filed the papers. Within a matter of days, Bob had no job, no home, no bank account, and no family in the house. The divorce proceedings that followed were complicated and protracted and ugly in the way that the dissolution of a thoroughly broken thing tends to be. Bob didn't go quietly into any of it. People who've spent years curating a particular version of themselves rarely do. He fought over assets that weren't really his. He made arguments that required a certain creative relationship with the facts. And at some point during those proceedings, in a moment that Ron heard about through someone who'd heard about it from someone else, Bob violated a restraining order. He went to the house, his former house, his father-in-law's house, and started an argument with his ex-wife that got loud enough and volatile enough to bring other people into the room. Her brother was there. I'll simply say that Bob left that encounter with a broken nose. I'll also say that the police arrived, assessed the situation, and arrested Bob. He spent time in a county jail cell, sitting on a concrete floor, in a building designed to remind you that the structures that held your life together are not as permanent as you assumed. I don't know exactly what he thought about in there. I'm not particularly interested in his inner life, but I imagine there were certain moments, the lunch at that restaurant, the motel parking lot, the confident smirk of a man who thought his borrowed position made him untouchable, that must have looked different from a jail cell floor. My own divorce moved through the courts without particular drama. The evidence was thorough, the documentation was clean, and the proceedings, while not painless, were over in a reasonable amount of time. My ex-wife and I shared custody of our children. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies. We were two adults who had agreed, implicitly and without ever quite discussing it, that our kids deserved better than the wreckage of whatever we chose to do with our anger toward each other. I held up my side of that agreement. I believe she held up hers. The kids grew up. They became people I'm genuinely proud of. That's the thing that mattered. I don't think about her much anymore. She occupies a very specific, very contained compartment of my past. The compartment where I keep things that shaped me without defining me. She was a chapter, not the book. Bob essentially vanished. His digital footprint dried up completely. A name that had once been attached to a title and a company and a neighborhood became gradually unsearchable. I heard through a mutual connection years later that he'd moved to another state, starting over in the particular reduced way that people start over when most of what they built has been taken back. His ex-wife, though, she did something I genuinely respect. She stepped into her father's company. She had spent years raising children and managing a household while her husband collected a salary from her family and spent pieces of it on Betrayal. And when all of that was cleared away and the space opened up, she turned out to be exactly the kind of person who rises in a vacuum. Her father retired. She became CEO. She runs the company that her husband once treated as a personal allowance. I've thought about that outcome many times over the years. How someone can absorb a profound humiliation and convert it quietly and without fanfare into something that actually belongs to them. How the thing that was meant to diminish you can occasionally, if you're built right, become the moment you figure out what you're actually capable of. I hope she knows how good that story is. I've told this story a few times to people I trust, usually late in the evening, the kind of conversation that happens when enough time has passed that you can look at a hard period of your life without flinching. And the question I always get, the one people can't quite resist asking, is whether I felt satisfaction, whether the whole thing delivered what I was hoping for. The honest answer is complicated. There was something in the weeks after everything unfolded that felt close to relief, not joy, not triumph. Relief, the specific physical sensation of a weight you've been carrying finally being set down. The evidence was gathered. The papers were filed. The truth was in the hands of the people who deserved to have it. I had done what I set out to do, and I had done it correctly. But satisfaction implies a kind of completion, and I'm not sure the word fits. Because the truth is, what I found out about my marriage didn't just tell me something about my wife. It told me something about myself, about how long I'd been willing to accept a version of my life that didn't match the reality underneath it, about how comfortable I'd gotten inside an explanation that only held together if I didn't look too closely. That part isn't a satisfying story. That part is just the slow, unglamorous work of understanding your own blind spots. My parents cheated on each other. I grew up watching two people use love as a weapon, watching the collateral damage of it spread through everything it touched. I made a promise to myself back then, a child's fierce, private promise, that I would never accept that I would see it clearly and respond to it decisively and not become the kind of person who absorbs cruelty because it's easier than confronting it. I kept that promise. I'm glad I kept it. But keeping a promise you made to your younger self doesn't erase the grief. It doesn't make the loss of a marriage, even a broken one, feel weightless. It doesn't fast forward past the nights when the house is quiet and your kids are asleep down the hall and you're sitting in the kitchen at midnight wondering how you missed it for so long. What it does is give you something to stand on, a floor beneath the grief, something that holds. Bob made a series of choices that unraveled everything he thought he'd built. My wife made choices that ended something that I'd invested years of my life in. I can't carry their decisions for them, and I stopped trying a long time ago. What I carry is the version of myself that went through it without becoming something I didn't want to be. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't destroy anything out of anger. I gathered the truth carefully. I gave it to the people who needed to have it, and I let the consequences fall where they were going to fall. The consequences fell hard. That's not something I engineered. That's just what happens when you remove the scaffolding from a life that was built entirely on other people's willingness not to look. Bob thought he was protected by his title, by his father-in-law's money, by the ordinary human tendency to avoid knowing things that hurt. He thought the architecture around him was load-bearing. He didn't understand that every piece of it belonged to someone else, and that the someone else would eventually find out, and that when they did, they would simply take it back. He wasn't brought down by anything elaborate. He was brought down by the truth existing. That's the part I think about most. Not the motel photographs or the jail cell or the broken nose or the name that eventually became unsearchable. Just the basic, almost boring fact that the truth was always there. It was always going to come out in some form through some channel at some point. People who build lives on other people's ignorance are always on borrowed time. I just decided how much time to give him. There's a man somewhere right now, I don't know where, I don't think about him often, who used to have an office with his name on the door and a driveway and a title that people used when they spoke to him. He thought that a certain kind of confidence made him permanent. He thought the rules that governed other people's lives applied to him more loosely, as a kind of optional suggestion. He was wrong. And the thing about being wrong about something that fundamental is that when the correction arrives, it doesn't arrive in pieces. It arrives all at once, simultaneously, from every direction, the same day, the same hour. A carefully constructed life meeting a carefully documented truth. My children are adults now. They're doing well. That's the thing I'm most proud of. Not the clean execution of a legal strategy, not the paperwork, not any of it. Just the kids. Just the fact that they grew up in a home that was honest, even when honest meant broken. I sleep fine. I have for a long time.